Well, after the death of Muhammad, there was a struggle within the Muslim community over who would lead that community, whether it would be a man picked from the community at large or someone from the Prophet's family. That struggle continued until eventually, at Karbala in Iraq, Muhammad's grandson and the man's infant son were brutally killed by a rival in a political struggle. Their deaths are commemorated every year in the Shiite holiday of Ashura. And there's a saying that Shiites have. Every day is Ashura, and every place is Karbala. And what that means is, in Shiite Islam, very much emphasis is placed on martyrdom and sacrifice. Now, when you look at Sunni Islam, in the Muslim world, there are roughly two kinds of Muslims, the Sunnis and the Shiites. 90% of the world's Muslims are Sunnis. Roughly 10% are Shiites. However, in the Middle East, that balance is different. Iran, majority Shiite. Iraq, majority Shiite. Saudi Arabia, majority Sunni. And the other kingdoms of the Gulf, majority Sunni. The divide that has existed within Islam since its beginning now manifests itself in wars over resources, in wars over territory, and actually wars over religion. Just as in Europe, Catholics and Protestants once fought for dominance, so too today, Sunnis and Shiites duke it out to see who will be supreme in that region. How does this affect you in America? How does this affect you in your daily lives? 40% of the oil that is traded globally comes from the Middle East, North Africa region. The price of oil is set on global markets. So what happens in the Middle East or happens in Venezuela or Nigeria affects what you pay at the pump. We are going into a long cycle of instability in the Middle East. The civil war that is now brewing between Sunnis and Shiites is a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And very soon, it will stop being a proxy war, but an actual war between those two nations and their allies. If you look at what happened during the war between Iran and Iraq in the 80s, for nearly 8 years, both countries slugged it out with over 1 million casualties, with the use on the Iraqi side of chemical weapons against Iranian troops, and with Iran using human wave tactics, even using children with keys to heaven around their neck to try and overwhelm Iraqi defenses. As Iran is now developing atomic weapons, the next war between Shiites and Sunnis won't take 8 years. It'll take 8 minutes to destroy the work of generations in the Middle East. You know, people have a lot of misconceptions about energy. They believe that oil is like you get a drink of water. When you get a drink of water, you turn on the spigot, you get your glass of water. That's not the case with oil. A war in the Middle East that involves the destruction of oil fields and ports will imperil the whole world's economic stability. We cannot just automatically replace 40% of the world's oil. It can't happen. So what do we need to do here in America now to stop the gathering storm? First of all, we need to develop our own oil and natural gas resources. We need to keep drilling to produce more oil. We need to keep drilling to produce more natural gas. With natural gas, we also have to make a switch, not only to use it to generate electricity, but to fuel our cars. You know, we've all heard of the subsidies the government offers for electric cars, and the fact that it demands that Detroit makes electric cars. Our government should demand, and we should demand as a public, that natural gas cars are available nationwide. So we can get off imported oil even quicker because it's necessary. All religions in the world have, in a sense, both their, let's say, their good side and their dark side. Christianity has helped many people throughout the world live lives based on peace and love. But we also know that there are faults within Christianity. Christianity has not always been a perfect vessel for what Christ wanted to do. Same thing with Islam. The vast majority of Muslims in the world are people just like us, with families, morals, and decent people. But there is in Islam the whole idea of jihad, fighting the unbeliever. There also are quotes from the Quran, which exhort believers in Islam to fight, which, of course, in Christianity, those things are absent. I often, when people ask me what's the difference between Islam and Christianity, I try and think about the life of Muhammad and the life of Christ. Christ, we believe he had a kingdom in heaven. But on this earth, he was just a simple man with followers who he taught. Muhammad was an earthly king. In order to establish his kingdom and to protect his followers, he had to become a general. He had to become a politician. He had to become a leader. So when Christians, if they were to imitate Christ, they would always be willing to sacrifice themselves and live with love for their fellow man. If I was to imitate Muhammad, I would have to be willing to be a warrior, a politician, as well as a religious figure. Is there something in Islam which leads to radicalism? Sure. Because as we all know, cultures that allow violence will sometimes, the culture will get out of hand. And that's what we're seeing now in the Middle East. And there are trigger factors in the Middle East today which are creating a gathering storm. You know, as I was researching the topics we're discussing today, I looked up some simple facts. In Cuba, socialist Cuba, 96% of the people can read and write. That's a great accomplishment for a poor country in the Caribbean. In Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, one of the places in the world where writing was invented. Today, only 56% of the population can read and write. If you can't read and you can't write, what future do you have in your own country? And what future does your country have in the global economy? You know, in Tunisia, a young man who was supporting his sister and his parents by being a fruit vendor was tired of being harassed by the police, tired of the corruption in his society. So he killed himself, and his death sparked the Arab uprising. Why did one man's death spark all across the Middle East uprisings? Because in countries across the Middle East, the same things occur. You have governments that are unresponsive to their people. You have young men without jobs. And you have societies that have really ceased to function. And that is what is causing a storm to gather in the Middle East. You know, I think we've all heard the expression banging your head against a wall. In our country, if you have a problem, you can go to the courts, you can petition your congressman, you can vote. In the Middle East, if you can vote, and a lot of times it's only for one candidate, petition your government, you're liable to be tortured. That's if you're lucky. People seek solace where they can find it. In our country, sometimes people seek solace in drugs and alcohol and other destructive behaviors. But in the Middle East, with such a puritanical culture, they seek solace and hope in their religion. And their religion tells them, you must obey your leaders if they're good Muslims. But if they are not good Muslims, you can fight them. And that's what we see taking place now in the Arab world, all across the Middle East. young men rising up against the tyrants of the Middle East. What does that matter to us? It matters to us because the doctrine preached by the Islamic State and preached by bin Laden and those like him is not just about making a better world for Muslims, but making a world where Christianity and secularism don't exist. You know, bin Laden, in one of his writings, he asked the question, why do I oppose? Why do we Muslims oppose you in the West? And you know, there were the standard answers, Palestine, degeneracy. But one of the reasons they opposed us in the West was our Constitution. Because we had the courage to make laws based on reason and enlightenment. And they believed that all laws should be based on the Quran and the writings and thoughts of men who lived hundreds or thousands of years ago. They hate our culture because of what we have achieved and what we think. And no matter what we do, whether we stop supporting Israel, whether we stop supporting America's allies in the Middle East, they will continue to hate us because they hate us because of who we are, not what we do. And that's something America must face. The best way to face that is, first of all, to limit our contact with that region, which means getting off their oil so they don't have that to hold over our heads. And secondly, it's being willing to fight for our interests. Jesus said, turn the other cheek, and that's wise advice. But Jesus also went into the temple with a whip and threw the money changers out. And Moses, when his people were being oppressed in Egypt, he said, let my people go. And God made them go. We must remember, self-defense is not only a right, it is an obligation. We have an obligation today to take the right steps for the future generations. The Islamic State in northern Syria and Iraq is financed at this point primarily through the sale of oil. During World War II, Nazi Germany's main supply of oil was from Romania. American bombers attacked those oil fields and bombed them to disable them. That was a legitimate target then, and it's a legitimate target now. The best thing America can do against the Islamic State is to attack the oil fields that are funding it and blow them up. That may seem harsh, but every single day, the money that is supporting the Islamic State is being used to kill people like us and prepare terrorists for attacks against us, not only in the Middle East, but eventually here in America. We need to look at the Islamic State as a virus. First thing you do with any disease is you quarantine it. And then you attack it. And then hopefully you eradicate it. You know, I think back to Afghanistan. There were people that warned the CIA and the leaders of our country that by supporting the Mujahideen as we did, we're making a deal with the devil. And we dismissed those warnings. And all those warnings came true on 9/11. Same thing with the Islamic State. You know, earlier I was speaking about the Russian Revolution. Lenin and the Bolsheviks came to power in St. Petersburg in 1917. When they came to power, they didn't control all of Russia. And soon they were facing armies from Japan, Britain, and America in one form or another, and also involved in a brutal civil war against remnants of the Tsar's regime and other forces that opposed them. They fought an all-out war against invading armies, foreigners, against their own people. And through Red Terror, they annihilated all of their enemies and took control, total control of Russia by 1921. You look at the Islamic State now, and you say to yourself, well, I know they have some territory, I know they have some population, but they're not this huge threat. They are. Because if you look at the leader of the Islamic State, al-Baghdadi, he is a student of Lenin's tactics, not his economic theories. Lenin and the Bolsheviks unleashed terror and hell on Russia, destroyed all opposition, and established an empire that would last for 70 years. And that's the great fear today in the Middle East, that the Islamic State, once it's begun, will spread and grow. Well, you know what? You go today to a gas station, you fill up your car. Easy, simple. But for that gas to get there, there's a long, torturous process that depends on everything working together. Oil infrastructure in the Middle East is incredibly vulnerable because it in itself is an explosive, flammable substance. Saddam Hussein, when he retreated out of Kuwait, set all the oil fields on fire, all the oil wells on fire. It took months of hard work to put them out. During Iran and Iraq's war, tankers were bombed. The easiest thing in the world is to attack oil fields and tankers at sea. Nearly defenseless. When you look at the situation in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia is the world's king of oil exports and has been for a long time. So the bulk of Saudi Arabia's oil is in the eastern province, which is where a sizable Shiite minority lives. Iran could easily stir up trouble in that region and use it as an excuse to invade Saudi Arabia. Oil infrastructure is the key to the world's economy, keeping it going, and is one of the most vulnerable links in the global economy. Well, America can, let's talk about the gathering storm. Churchill, in the 30s, was out of power in Great Britain. But he did everything in his power to warn the British people, the American people, and the people in Europe about Hitler and the Nazis, about what was going to happen. People didn't listen. Hitler could have been stopped at many points along the way. He wasn't. And tens of millions of people died around the globe. I see a similar storm gathering today, but not in Europe, in the Middle East. And that storm needs to be stopped. What steps can we take? There are several. First of all, let's address the situation in the Middle East. We need to return in the Middle East to secular politics and secular governments. As hard as that will be, that is part of the solution. When you look at the situation with Christians in northern Iraq and Syria, in our country, if I have a problem, I call the police. The police will come and help me. In those countries, if a Christian is attacked, no one's going to come help them. We need to make sure that the rights of Christians, other minorities, are protected in the nations of the Middle East. And one of the ways we can do that is by telling Christians it's our right to stand up for themselves. Because they're fearful and afraid. Just as the Jews in Nazi Germany were afraid to fight back, by being afraid to fight back, you make yourself a perfect victim and you just encourage further terror. Not only do we need to encourage them to stand up for themselves, we need to pressure, for instance, Iraq's government to arm and train Christians and Yazidis to defend themselves and be able to fight back against Islamic terror, and to also include them in the government. Saddam Hussein could have Christians in his government. Certainly, this present government of Iraq can do a better job of representing all of its people, not just some of them. And the other thing is, too, you look at countries like Saudi Arabia. Each country has its own tradition, in its own way, and its own path, and that's fine. But there should not be a single country in this world where one isn't free to exercise one's conscience, to believe or not to believe. We have to make it a priority, respecting individuals' conscience, religious freedom, and choice in every country of the world. I'll just tell you a little bit about my background, as I said I would at the beginning. The first film I directed was called Gas Odyssey, and it was about the development of the Marcellus Shale in northeast Pennsylvania, Dimock, Montrose, and what we in New York State hoped developing the Marcellus would do for us in upstate. After that, I worked on some other films on energy and other topics. I came to this topic of the gathering storm because I'm a student of history. I look at trends. I look at what is likely to happen. Not what I want to happen, but what I know will happen. The world is in a bad place today, and it's headed to a worse place. American leadership is critical to stop what is happening in the Middle East and to keep us safe here in America. You know, the Islamic State is dreaming a big dream, but I think we here in America and in the West should dream a better dream. We should dream a dream where all people in the Middle East share the same land, if not the same faith. We should work for a world where Christians in the Middle East die in their beds, not in their streets. We have a responsibility here in America to develop our own oil and gas, and not to use the oil and gas of others when we have been provided with plenty of resources here for us to use. We don't need necessarily to fight, but we do need to be smarter. One way to defeat the enemy is to stop giving him the money he's going to use to kill you. I would rather buy my energy from Montrose than Mosul. I would rather pay a farmer in Pennsylvania than a sheik in Saudi Arabia for my energy. You know, it's personal to me because not only is there a gathering storm in the Middle East, there's a gathering storm here in America. I was born in Binghamton, New York in the 70s, and I watched with sadness as my hometown basically died, as businesses left, as people left, and the town and the area I'm from became a shadow of itself. In many parts of the United States of America, people don't have hope. People don't believe in a better future. Developing our own resources can provide that better future. We need to change the path we are on, because there's a storm gathering within our own borders. Never before have people in America felt so hopeless, so helpless. And the reason they feel that way, our government knows the solutions to the problems of our economy. But because of philosophy and ideology, they will not take the steps that are necessary to make America great and strong again. You know, I would ask that everyone who's watching this, everyone who's hearing this, apathy is our greatest enemy. Action is the cure for apathy. Contact your government. You know what's right. Everyone knows in their heart what we need to do in America to make us great again. Do those things. Develop our own resources. Rebuild our economies in towns like Binghamton and Syracuse. Give the next generation a better life. Or someday, life in America may look a lot like life in Baghdad.